When I was younger, around 14 or 15, my family used to camp every summer at a big state park about 2 hours from our house. It was one of those parks with a big lake, lots of trails, and campsites set among tall pine trees. The ground was covered in pine needles and leaves, and the smell of the woods was sharp and earthy. At night, you could hear crickets and frogs, and sometimes the distant sounds of people talking or laughing from other campsites. I always loved those trips because it felt like a different world away from school and the normal routine. I usually went with my parents and sometimes my younger brother, and we'd stay for a week. My friend Jake's family also camped there a lot, and he and I would meet up as soon as we arrived. The two of us thought we were pretty adventurous back then, and every night, after our parents were settled around their fires, we'd go for long walks through the woods. We called it the ritual, like it was some secret thing only we did. We loved how quiet the forest was at night, the way our footsteps crunched softly on the leaves, and how the trees loomed tall all around us, blocking out most of the moonlight. We both carried small flashlights, but we liked to turn them off and see how far we could go just using starlight. There was something thrilling about it, like testing our bravery. The woods looked totally different without the flashlights. Shapes blurred together, branches seemed to reach out toward us, and sometimes we'd hear noises. A stick snapping or leaves rustling, and our hearts would pound. But we'd laugh it off, pretending we weren't scared. One night, about halfway through our camping trip, we decided to go farther into the woods than we ever had. It was pretty late, maybe close to midnight. The air was cool and damp, and the trees were dripping a little from dew that formed as the temperature dropped. We'd been walking for about 20 minutes, heading deeper along a narrow dirt trail that wound between the trees. We were probably half a mile away from the nearest campsite, and it felt like we were completely alone in the woods. We'd been walking with our flashlights off, feeling our way along the trail. We could barely see the path under our feet. It was mostly just darkness with a faint silvery glow from the moon, which slipped in and out of the clouds overhead. The smell of the pine needles was stronger the deeper we went, mixed with the scent of damp soil. Every few seconds, I could hear distant sounds from the lake, a fish splashing or maybe a bullfrog calling. We were moving slow, careful not to trip over roots, when I suddenly thought I heard something behind us. It was faint, like a soft whispering. At first I thought it was just the wind shifting through the branches, but it had a strange rhythm, like a voice trying to form words. I froze for a second, my skin prickling all over. I stood still, listening hard, trying to figure out if it was just my imagination. The woods were dead silent except for a few bugs buzzing. I was about to keep walking when I heard it again. A soft whispering sound, closer this time, sent a chill through my chest. I turned on my flashlight and spun around fast, the beam cutting through the darkness, swinging back and forth across the trees and bushes. But there was nothing there, just black trunks and tangled branches. My friend switched on his flashlight too, and we both stood there breathing hard, scanning the forest behind us. The ground was littered with brown leaves and pine cones. Our beams flashed across tree bark and patches of low ferns. Everything looked still and empty. I tried to tell myself it was probably some animal rustling around, maybe a raccoon or a possum. Still, the hair on my arms was standing up, and my mouth felt dry. We kept walking, deciding we were just spooking ourselves. I tried to focus on the crunch of our footsteps, the coolness of the air, and the smell of pine. But after a few minutes, the whispering came again, even clearer than before. This time it definitely sounded like words, though I couldn't make out what they were. It was like someone mumbling just out of hearing range. We both stopped. My chest felt tight, and I could hear my own pulse pounding in my ears. I swept my light around in circles, shining it into the shadows between tree trunks. The forest seemed endless, branches tangled up like black nets. A few leaves fell, drifting down slowly through my light beam. I felt like we were being watched. The woods felt closer somehow, the trees pressing in. I kept thinking how far we were from the campground, how there were no other people out here this late, and how nobody would even know if we got lost or hurt. Then, a few yards off the trail, I finally saw what was making the noise. At first, I thought it was an animal crawling on the ground. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was a person. A woman, down on her hands and knees in the leaves and dirt. Her clothes were dark, and she was covered in smears of dirt and pine needles. Her hair was long and hanging forward around her face like a curtain. She was whispering a string of random words, as if talking to herself. Her voice was soft and shaky, and sometimes she'd pause, then start again. I felt a wave of shock so strong that my legs nearly gave out. Seeing a person out here crawling like that, in the middle of the night, was one of the creepiest things I've ever witnessed. My brain couldn't process it at first. For a second, I wondered if I was dreaming. Then she suddenly looked up. Her eyes were wide and unfocused, and she blinked like she was trying to clear her vision. She rose to her feet, swaying a little, and started stumbling toward us. The smell of sweat and dirt came off her in waves. She was trembling, her clothes hanging loose and damp with sweat. She kept mumbling about needing to find her campsite and something about the bathroom. Though her words were all mixed up and slurred, it became obvious pretty quickly that she was either drunk, high, or both. Her pupils were big, and she seemed confused about where she was. Her skin looked pale under the flashlight, and she was shivering even though it wasn't that cold. She kept glancing around like she was afraid of something in the trees. My heart was still racing, but I felt a different kind of fear then. Fear for her. She looked so vulnerable out there in the dark. The idea of someone wandering alone in the woods, crawling on the ground, whispering to herself, was unsettling in a way I hadn't expected. We decided to help her back to the campground. She could barely walk straight, tripping over roots and rocks. The trip back felt like it took forever. The shadows seemed to move around us, and every sound made me jump. I kept shining my light behind us, worried something else might be lurking in the trees. When we finally made it back to the edges of the campground, we guided her toward the rows of tents and campers. The noise of people talking and laughing around their fires felt jarring after the silence of the woods. We started checking different campsites, trying to see if anyone knew her. Eventually, we found a group of people who recognized her. They were sitting around a fire, drinking beers and telling stories. Turned out she was part of their group. They hadn't even noticed she was missing. She'd wandered off in the dark, probably trying to find a bathroom, and gotten turned around in the woods. She'd apparently been drinking heavily and might have taken something else, which explained why she was so out of it. Seeing her safe, I felt a mix of relief and leftover fear. My body was still buzzing with adrenaline. As we headed back to my family's campsite, I kept thinking how bad things could have gone. She could have been out there all night, cold and alone, or even gotten hurt. It scared me to realize how easy it was to get lost in those woods, especially in the dark, and how fragile people really are out there. When I finally crawled into my sleeping bag that night, my mind was still replaying the image of her crawling through the dirt, whispering random words. It was one of the scariest things I'd ever seen, not because of monsters or ghosts, but because it was real. A person who'd simply lost her way and might not have made it back if we hadn't gone deeper into the woods than usual. Looking back on it now, I'm glad we were there. It was one of those moments that taught me how quickly something ordinary can turn into something terrifying, and how sometimes the real world is scarier than anything you can imagine. It also made me realize that helping someone, even when you're scared, is the right thing to do. And even though the memory still creeps me out, I'm thankful we were able to help that woman get back safely, instead of her being lost all night in the dark woods alone. I've always loved camping alone. I like the silence, the smell of pine needles, and the way the stars look when there's no city lights around. I like how I can hear myself think out there, and how everything seems bigger and sharper. So last fall, I decided to take a solo camping trip up in the northern part of Montana, near Glacier National Park. I wanted to go somewhere a little remote, but not too far off the beaten path because I'm not stupid. I had my gear packed tight in my backpack. A tent, sleeping bag, food for 3 days, water filter, bear spray, a good knife, and my small camping stove. I also carried a small first aid kit, a headlamp, and a pair of binoculars because I like watching wildlife. I parked my truck at a small dirt turnout and started hiking along a narrow trail through thick trees. The air smelled cold and fresh, and yellow leaves were blowing down in little spirals from the aspens. It was late afternoon, and the sun was dipping low, shining gold through the trees. I walked for about 2 hours until I reached a small clearing by a creek. The water made a soft gurgling noise over the rocks, and I could see animal tracks in the muddy banks. Mostly deer, maybe some smaller critters like raccoons. I dropped my pack and felt that nice relief of the weight leaving my shoulders. I set up my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag inside, and started boiling water for my freeze-dried meal. As the sun went down, the woods filled with sounds, little snaps and rustles as animals moved around. I've camped plenty of times, so those noises don't scare me much. They're normal. I ate my dinner sitting on a log, watching my breath puff out white in the cool air. When the stars came out, I crawled into my tent, zipped myself in, and listened to the creek as I fell asleep. The next day, I woke up early, while the trees were still dripping with dew. I made coffee on my little stove and sat watching steam rise off the creek. I hiked around most of the day, taking pictures, following animal trails, and checking out the ridgelines for good views. The sun was bright, but the wind was cold, and the ground was crunchy in spots with frost that hadn't melted. I saw elk tracks, and once, high up on a slope, I spotted the silhouette of a big bird, maybe a golden eagle. I felt calm and alive the way I always do out there. By the time I got back to my campsite, the sun was going down again. I made dinner and sat there thinking about how quiet the world felt. It was one of those perfect camping days. That night, I woke up to a noise that didn't belong. It wasn't the normal rustling of mice or squirrels, or the thud of a pine cone falling. It was soft but heavy footsteps moving through the dry leaves outside my tent. The steps were slow and careful, not the quick scurry of a little animal. They would stop for a few seconds, then continue, circling my tent. I lay there frozen, listening, trying to breathe as quietly as I could. My heart was hammering so hard that I thought whatever it was could hear me. I reached slowly for the bear spray near my head. I kept telling myself it was probably just a deer sniffing around my campsite. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The steps were too silent and too deliberate. They made almost no noise, but they were there, padding softly over the leaves, and once I heard a low exhale, like air puffing out of an animal's nose. I stayed there for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 20 minutes. Eventually, the steps moved off into the trees, and the sounds faded. I lay awake, ears straining for any sign that it was coming back. My mouth was dry as dust. Finally, around dawn, I dozed off for an hour or so. When I unzipped my tent in the morning, the air was freezing, and a layer of thin frost covered everything. I stepped out slowly, feeling like my legs were made of rubber. I scanned the clearing, half expecting nothing to be there, and half expecting some giant animal staring back at me. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Then I walked over toward the edge of my campsite, where the dirt met the grass near the creek. That's when I saw the tracks. They were huge paw prints, bigger than any dog I'd ever seen, pressed deep into the damp earth. For toes, claws visible in front. The tracks were spaced wide apart, showing how long the animal's stride was. I bent down and laid my hand beside one print, and it was nearly as long as my entire palm. I felt a cold wave run through me as I realized exactly what I was looking at. Wolf tracks. The wolf had circled my tent several times. The prints went around and around in a wide loop, then led off into the trees, heading north. I felt exposed, as if the wolf could be standing right at the tree line, watching me. I kept glancing up, scanning the shadows between the trunks. All day I felt jumpy. Every twig snap made me flinch. I tried to hike around a bit to distract myself, but I kept looking over my shoulder. The woods seemed different somehow, quieter, as if even the birds were keeping low. I knew wolves usually avoid people, but knowing that one had come so close while I slept made me uneasy. I kept picturing it outside my thin nylon tent, circling silently, maybe trying to decide if I was food or just something to leave alone. That evening, I made dinner early because I didn't want to be outside in the dark. The sky turned a deep pink over the mountains, and the wind rattled dry leaves in the trees. I packed up as much gear as I could so I'd have less to do in the morning. My plan was to hike out at first light. That night, I barely slept. Every sound felt louder. I thought I heard movement once or twice, but it might have been my imagination. At one point, something brushed against the side of my tent and made the fabric shiver, but then there was nothing. I lay there gripping my bear spray, staring at the ceiling of my tent, counting my breath. When dawn finally came, the light was pale and watery. I crawled out and looked around. The tracks were fresher this time, closer to my tent than before. The wolf had definitely come back during the night. There were prints so close that one paw mark was half on the flattened ground where my tent was staked. That did it for me. I decided not to stay another night. I packed everything fast, rolling my sleeping bag with trembling hands. The air was sharp in my nose as I hiked out. Every time I thought I heard footsteps behind me, I stopped and listened, but nothing appeared. I kept glancing backward, scanning the path. After a couple of miles, I finally started to relax. The closer I got to the trailhead, the more the forest seemed normal again. Birds calling, squirrels chattering, the sun beginning to warm the ground. When I reached my truck, I threw my pack in the back and just stood there for a minute, breathing the dusty smell of the road. I felt exhausted but relieved. As I drove out, I kept looking in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see a gray shape standing in the trees. But the road was empty, and the trees swayed gently in the wind. I know wolves are part of the wild, and they usually avoid people. I don't hate them for what happened, but that trip reminded me that out there, I'm just another animal. My tent walls are only fabric, and I'm not the top of the food chain. Next time I go camping alone, I'll still go, but I'll pick a different spot, maybe closer to a few other campers. And I'll never forget the way it felt to lie there in the dark, listening to a wolf breathing just outside my tent, circling and deciding what I was. But I made it out safe and nothing bad actually happened to me. I got back home, took the longest shower of my life, and sat on my couch with a hot mug of coffee, feeling grateful for walls and doors. The fear faded a little once I was back in my own space. Now, when I think about that trip, it's still scary, but I'm also glad I went. It taught me respect, and it made me feel more alive than anything else I've ever done. And that, in its own way, was worth it. Camping has always been this mix of peace and unease for me. I love the escape, the quiet, the simple routines, boiling water for coffee, the smell of pine in the morning, walking barefoot on packed dirt paths. But there's always this little sliver of nervousness tucked somewhere in the back of my mind. I think anyone who's camped far enough away from civilization knows that feeling. You pitch your tent somewhere deep in the woods or out along a beach trail, miles from lights or cell signal or the thud of another person's boot, and everything feels thinner. Like the line between being totally fine and something going horribly wrong isn't as thick as it is back in town. That feeling was with me the entire second night I spent camping on Assateague Island. If you don't know the place, Assateague is a long barrier island off the coast of Maryland and Virginia. It's famous for wild ponies, small, thick-bodied, kind of scruffy animals that roam the dunes and salt marshes. It's one of those places people love to visit because of how wild it still feels. No boardwalk, no noisy attractions. Just sand, wind, sky, and horses that don't give a damn about your camping trip. I'd gone there alone in early October, hoping to catch some late-season peace and quiet. The campsites were spaced out enough that you didn't really hear other people, especially if you picked the more primitive walk-in options. I found one nestled against a low rise of dunes, tucked back behind a tangle of salt grass and stunted trees that leaned away from the sea. I spent the first day getting my little solo camp squared away. Tent staked down, cooler stashed, camp stove set up, gear bag packed tight against the damp. The air was crisp, a little warmer than I expected for the season. I didn't see any ponies that day, though there were plenty of hoof prints in the sand and dung piles left near the trail. I knew the rules. Don't feed them, don't touch them, keep your food sealed. They might look tame, but they were wild animals. Most of them weren't afraid of people. They just did what they wanted. That first night was uneventful. I laid in my tent with the rainfly half open, watching the moonlight wash over the tops of the dune grasses and listening to the ocean drag in and out in the distance. No creepy sounds, no weird feelings. I woke up once to what I thought was something stepping on a stick nearby, but it was probably just the wind tossing stuff around. The second night is the one I still think about. Started like the first: quiet evening, decent meal, a short walk through the sand at dusk. The temperature dropped fast after sundown, and I was zipped into my sleeping bag before 10:30. I remember reading something on my phone for a bit, before finally letting myself drift off. Then, around 2 o'clock in the morning, I woke up, and I had no idea why. At first, I thought maybe it was the wind, but it was completely still. No flapping tent walls, no rustling branches, no surf. Everything had gone dead silent. That kind of silence in the wild doesn't feel peaceful. It feels like holding your breath, like the world is waiting for something. I lay there for a while, not moving, ears open, eyes scanning the inside of the tent. Then I noticed the shadow. It wasn't inside the tent. It was outside, but close enough to block the faint moonlight coming through the thin nylon walls. It was right outside the back end of the tent, in the corner where I kept my boots and the edge of my pack tucked. And it wasn't moving. Now, this is the part where my brain started doing that thing it always does when you wake up at 2 a.m. and see something strange in the dark. It started spinning stories faster than logic could keep up. The shadow was shaped weird, tall, slightly hunched, with what looked like this mess of wiry hair falling forward. The moonlight made it all worse, casting that silvery, soft glow across the tent's inner wall. I couldn't see any details, just the outline, but I could swear it looked like a figure. A woman, not just standing, leaning. She looked like she was bending in, watching me sleep. It made no sense. I was miles from any town, half a mile from the nearest other campsite. No one should be out here. No one should be near my tent. I remember how fast my heart was beating, the kind of pounding that makes your ears throb. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe heavy. I just stared at that shape, trying to figure out what it was, if it was even real. That's when a part of me, the paranoid part, whispered a word I hadn't thought in years. Bruja. I don't know why. It's not even a word I use. But in that moment, with that shape just outside my tent, my half-asleep brain whispered, "There's a bruja out there and she's watching you." It was the hair that did it. The way it was hanging. Long, stringy, uncombed. It looked like something right out of a nightmare. I almost threw up. I was so certain something bad was about to happen, that she'd crouch lower, press a face against the mesh, unzip the tent flap, do something. My mind was already past the point of no return, telling me, "She picked you. You're alone. You're the one she came for." Then it moved. Not the way a person would. Not a footstep or a shift. The entire mass rotated. And I realized it wasn't a head. It was a rear end. The hair was a tail. The woman was a pony. A small wild horse, standing with its butt right up against my tent wall, apparently asleep or resting or just zoned out in that half-aware way some animals do. I was staring at a pony's ass for 5 straight minutes thinking I was about to get snatched by a forest witch. The rush of relief hit me like a flood. I almost laughed. Felt like air was coming back into the world. Like the silence had broken. My ears even started to ring a little as I adjusted to the shift. The pony flicked its tail once and wandered off, its hooves making that soft crunching noise as it walked across the sand and back toward the path near the dune. It was just a pony, standing dumbly with its rear pressed against my tent. That's all. Finding out that the crazy bruja who had her sights set on me was actually just a wild pony's ass? Absolutely heart-lightening. I sat there in the tent, zipped all the way up in my sleeping bag, and let out this long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My heart was still hammering, but now it was from the letdown. The wave of stupid, hilarious clarity that always follows a panic attack when you realize you were terrified of nothing. I stayed awake the rest of the night, not because I was scared anymore, but because I couldn't stop smiling. Every time I remembered how convinced I was that my time had come, and how certain I was that something evil was outside the tent, I wanted to laugh. That dumb pony had parked its butt right at the worst angle and scared a grown adult half to death. When morning came, I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the cool, pale sunlight. Sure enough, there were hoof prints everywhere. One set leading right up to the tent wall in a half circle, exactly where I'd seen the shadow. There was even a smudge on the tent fabric where it had leaned. I walked around the site slowly, checking for anything else out of place. Everything was fine. Nothing had been disturbed. No signs of other campers, no tracks besides the ponies. Just the lingering scent of salt air, fresh hoofprints in the sand, and that rising morning heat that turns everything golden. I packed up camp after breakfast. I'd planned to stay a third night, but I felt like the trip had already given me its full story. Even now, when I think about that night, I get this strange, contented feeling. Not just because I wasn't in danger, but because of how powerfully our minds can trick us when we're vulnerable. How thin the line is between panic and comedy, between horror and harmlessness. That moment reminded me of something important. The wilderness doesn't need ghosts or monsters to scare you. Sometimes, all it takes is the perfect alignment of darkness, tired eyes, and a horse's backside. And somehow I find that comforting. Growing up, I always wanted to be the kind of person who could enjoy silence. I don't mean just sitting still for a few minutes. I mean the real kind of silence, the heavy kind, the kind you only get far away from other people, the kind you feel more than hear. I thought if I could learn to love that kind of silence, it would make me tougher somehow, calmer, stronger. I used to imagine camping trips that would clear my mind and strip everything back to the basics. Just me, the ground, the wind, and the dark. That kind of thinking landed me in some strange places over the years. I started out camping in the local woods behind my neighborhood, then worked my way up to solo weekend trips in state parks, and eventually out-of-state forests. I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone else. I just wanted to prove to myself that I could be alone out there and be okay. I used to read other people's stories online about weird things they saw or experienced in the woods. Some were clearly made up, glowing eyes, things that mimicked voices, children's laughter deep in the forest, that kind of thing. But the ones that stuck with me were always the simple ones. The ones where something just felt wrong and never quite explained itself. Those were the ones that sank their claws in. There's one trip in particular that stayed with me more than the others. I still think about it often, and for reasons I can't explain, it brings me a strange sort of peace. I don't know why. It scared the hell out of me at the time. Still gives me chills when I remember it in the middle of the night. But somehow, thinking about it now, years later, gives me this odd sense of comfort. It happened on a solo trip to a lesser-known stretch of national forest in Pennsylvania. This wasn't one of those well-groomed campgrounds with fire rings and water pumps. It was real backcountry. You parked on the side of a dirt road, followed a fading trailhead for a mile or two, then bushwhacked deeper in until the trees swallowed everything. I had done that kind of camping a few times before, and it always gave me the sense that I was doing something special, like I was stepping outside of normal life and into something untouched. That weekend, I had 2 full days and nights carved out. The forecast was clear. It was mid-autumn, dry, and cool. The air had that crisp edge that made the forest feel sharper. The leaves were already orange and red, and the crunch of them under my boots was constant. I hiked in for a few hours, veering off the faint trail once it thinned out, and eventually found a spot that felt right. A small clearing surrounded by maple and birch trees, soft moss underfoot, just enough flat space to pitch a one-person tent and cook. It was quiet. No sounds but the occasional breeze and the ticking of falling leaves. I set up camp, filtered water from a nearby creek, cooked a simple meal on my camp stove, and settled in for the night. No fire, I didn't want the smell or the glow drawing anything in. I sat outside for a while, headlamp off, just staring into the dark and listening. It was peaceful, real peace, the kind I thought I'd always wanted. That first night passed without much to note. I heard some rustling in the underbrush at one point, maybe a raccoon or a fox, but nothing close enough to worry about. When I woke up the next morning, everything was undisturbed. I made coffee, packed a small bag, and went exploring deeper into the forest. The place was beautiful. The canopy let sunlight through in wide patches, making the leaves on the ground glow gold and copper. I found an old dry creek bed that twisted between the hills like a bony finger. Further up, I spotted what looked like the remains of a collapsed hunting blind nailed to the trees, maybe decades old. I didn't touch it. I made it back to camp by late afternoon and started getting things in order for the second night. Filtering water, boiling some food, stowing everything carefully to avoid attracting animals. I remember taking a long moment just standing there, feeling the cold air settle in, hearing nothing at all, not even birds. That kind of quiet hits differently after you've been in it for a while. It doesn't feel peaceful. It starts to feel watched. That night, I went to bed early. I was tired from the hiking and the air had dropped fast. It was cold enough that I curled into the sleeping bag fully clothed, even my hat on. I kept my knife and headlamp close, like always, just out of habit. I woke up hours later in complete silence. I didn't open my eyes at first. I just lay there trying to figure out what had changed. The forest has its own rhythm at night. Wind, branches creaking, leaves shifting. But now it felt like the whole world had gone still. That kind of silence isn't just silence. Feels heavy, like it's pressing down on you. I opened my eyes and looked up through the tent mesh. The moon was out, big and bright. Pale light cast shadows on the tent walls. I could see the outline of my gear bag, the ridge of my boots. Everything looked normal, but something felt wrong. I shifted slightly in the sleeping bag and froze. There was something outside the tent. I couldn't see it clearly, just a change in the shadows, a faint disturbance in the shape of the moonlight on the sidewall. At first, I thought it might be a deer, maybe a black bear, though I hadn't seen any signs. I waited. No sound, no movement. Then the shadow moved. It didn't walk. It shifted, slowly, like someone crouching lower. I held my breath. I was suddenly aware of how thin the tent wall was. Just fabric between me and whatever that was. Then it got lower again. The shadow seemed to stretch out, like it was lying down. I didn't know what to do. I thought about grabbing the headlamp, but I didn't want to make noise. I lay there, breathing shallow, waiting for the shape to move again. After what felt like an hour, I finally forced myself to sit up slowly and grab the lamp. I clicked it on and shined it through the mesh. Nothing. I unzipped the top flap and aimed the light outward. The clearing was empty. No prints, no movement, just a cold breeze and falling leaves. I sat there a long time, scanning the area in circles with the beam of the lamp. Eventually, I crawled back into the bag, heart still hammering, and stayed awake until the sky turned pale. The next morning, I checked the area carefully. I expected to find signs, tracks, broken branches, something, but the ground around the tent was clean. No marks at all. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, just inches away from where I slept. I packed up that morning and started hiking back early. The whole way out, I kept stopping to look behind me, to listen, to check shadows. Nothing followed. Nothing moved. Just the usual forest sounds coming back to life as the sun warmed the ground again. By the time I made it to the car, I felt foolish, like maybe I had dreamed it or exaggerated it in my mind. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other harmless animal. My brain had played tricks on me in the silence. That's all. But I knew it wasn't just that. A week later, I was going through my gear at home, cleaning, drying, organizing for the next trip, and I found something I hadn't noticed before. My gear bag, the one I kept zipped shut inside the tent with me, had a small streak of mud across the side. Not a smear, a streak, like something with a wet hand or paw had brushed against it. I hadn't stepped in mud the whole trip. The ground had been dry. I hadn't dropped the bag. It was just there. A single streak, as if something had reached under the rainfly and touched it. Then nothing else. I threw the bag away. For some reason, that scared me more than the night itself. That one small detail, something real, something I didn't imagine. It confirmed that something had been there, and it had touched my stuff. I never reported it, never told anyone, really, not because I was ashamed or thought they'd laugh, but because I didn't think it would matter. Nothing happened. I wasn't hurt. My gear wasn't taken. No animal attacked me. There was no resolution. Just the cold, silent moment in the night when I was certain I wasn't alone. And somehow, thinking about that now, all these years later, brings me a weird sense of calm. Not because it was scary, but because it ended. I made it through. The forest let me leave. It reminds me that nature isn't ours, that when we walk deep enough into it, we're guests, strangers, watched from just outside the edges of firelight and flashlight beams. I still camp, still hike alone, but I keep my eyes open a little more now. I sleep lighter. I don't crave silence the way I used to, and every now and then, when I'm lying in the dark somewhere deep in the woods, I think back to that night. That cold, breathless quiet, that shifting shadow just outside the tent. And I smile, because I'm not sure why, but I find that story so cheering. I've always liked camping, not the kind where you park an RV in a lot with power hookups and lawn chairs lined up outside like a fake front porch. I'm talking about real camping, hiking out with your gear on your back, setting up somewhere quiet, far from roads and cell signals. No generators, no light pollution, no neighbors you didn't invite. Just the trees, the fire, and whatever's in your pack. That kind of peace is rare. When it's good, there's nothing like it. It was late October when I decided to take a solo weekend trip. I had just gotten over a rough stretch at work and felt like I needed to clear my head. I had a spot in mind, national forest land about 2 hours north of where I live in Georgia. It wasn't an official campground, just a wide space off an old service trail. I'd found it a couple years back while hiking with friends. They never wanted to come back because it was too isolated, too far from everything. That made it perfect for me. I packed light but careful. Tent, sleeping bag, small stove, some canned food, water purifier, flashlight, extra batteries, and a decent knife. The weather had started to cool down but wasn't cold yet. Mid-50s during the day, high 30s at night. Dry too. Good hiking weather. I left early Friday morning, drove up a winding road past the last gas station, and parked off the side of the dirt path that led toward the woods. There was no sign, no gate, just a break in the trees that most people wouldn't look at twice. I strapped on my pack and started walking in. The trail narrowed as I went. Leaves had fallen from the trees and carpeted the ground in gold and brown. The further I walked, the quieter it got. No cars, no distant hum of anything human. Just birds, the wind, and the occasional rustle from squirrels darting through the brush. After about a mile and a half, I reached the clearing. It was exactly how I remembered it. A flat area surrounded by tall pines and hardwoods. Some old logs were scattered around like fallen benches, probably from storms long past. A shallow fire ring, blackened with ash, sat in the middle. No signs of other campers, no trash, no footprints, nothing disturbed. That's how I like it. I set up my tent under a group of trees near the edge of the clearing, where the ground sloped slightly upward. I always avoid low ground in case of rain. Laid out my sleeping bag, unpacked my food, and made a small fire from dry wood nearby. The air smelled like pine needles and smoke. I ate a quick dinner, just soup and bread, and watched the flames until they faded into glowing coals. When night came, it came fast. Out there, the dark drops like a curtain. No porch lights, no moon that night either. Just blackness and the tiny glow of my camp lantern. I turned it off once I crawled into my tent and stretched out inside my bag. I lay still, listening. The forest at night is a different place. It's not silent. There are always sounds. Branches creaking in the wind, leaves skittering, the call of an owl somewhere in the trees. But everything sounds sharper, closer. You notice things you wouldn't hear in daylight. Took me a while to fall asleep, but I did. I woke up around 2:30 in the morning. It wasn't a sound that woke me, not directly. It was the feeling that something was wrong. That weird stillness. The kind that pulls you out of sleep like a hand on your chest. I stayed still and listened. Nothing. No wind. No leaves rustling. Not even a single insect. It was completely silent. I sat up a little, staying inside the sleeping bag, and strained to hear. A second later, I caught it. A soft sound, like leaves shifting under careful steps. It wasn't constant. A step, then quiet, then another, then a pause. It wasn't a deer. I've heard deer in the woods before. They move faster, bolder, sometimes loud and clumsy. This was different. Slow, deliberate. The steps circled my campsite. I didn't move. I reached for my flashlight slowly and clicked it on. I aimed it at the tent wall, trying to avoid making a silhouette in case someone or something was watching. The light made the fabric glow pale white, and for a second I thought I saw a shadow pass across it. No sound now, just the faint ringing in my ears from trying to listen too hard. I didn't unzip the tent. Something in my gut told me not to. If it was a person, I didn't want to confront them alone in the dark. If it was an animal, I didn't want to spook it. Either way, nothing good comes from opening your tent when something's out there. I sat that way for nearly an hour, light on, listening, waiting. After a while, the footsteps stopped. Or maybe they never were that close. Maybe it was just the leaves moving on their own. That's what I told myself. Eventually, I clicked off the light and lay back down. I didn't sleep much after that. Morning came slow. I opened the tent as the first light started to spill through the trees. Cold air poured in. I got up, stretched, and walked the perimeter of my campsite. I didn't see any tracks, but the leaves were thick. Hard to tell if anything had passed through. I made coffee and sat by the cold fire ring. The forest was alive again. Birds chirping, insects buzzing, wind moving through the branches like it hadn't stopped all night. I tried to shake off the tension, told myself it had just been my imagination. Maybe a raccoon or a fox. Something small, curious, harmless. But that feeling hadn't gone away. That pressure in my chest, that heavy sense of being watched, it stayed with me all day. I walked a few trails around the area, collected firewood, and sat for a while near a dry creek bed, just listening. Always listening. That night, I made a larger fire. I sat closer to it. I didn't drink. I wanted my head clear. When I finally got back into the tent, I kept my flashlight in my hand, fully charged. I lay awake for a long time. The normal night sounds returned at first. Bugs, wind, distant animals. But around midnight, everything stopped again. Just like before, like someone hit the mute button on the world. I clicked on the light, sat up, and listened. Nothing for several minutes. Then a sound, closer this time. It was unmistakable. Footsteps, not animal, human, slow, careful. They stopped just outside the tent. Couldn't breathe. I didn't move. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. No talking, no tools, just the presence of someone standing outside, just feet away. I kept the flashlight off now. My heart was pounding so loud I thought whoever was out there would hear it. The tent fabric was thin. One quick slice and someone could be inside. But then I heard it again, the faint sound of leaves brushing together. Then footsteps moving away, slowly at first, then faster. Still no talking, still no lights. I sat frozen until dawn. I never unzipped the tent. When the light finally returned, I got out and looked around. Again, no tracks, no signs. But I knew what I heard. That was my last day. I packed fast, skipped breakfast, shoved everything into my pack, didn't even fold the tent. I hiked out without stopping, glancing behind me every few minutes. The woods felt tighter, not like they were closing in, but like they were watching. I don't know how else to put it. When I reached the car, I didn't look back. I drove straight home. No gas station stop, no food, no music. Just silence. I didn't report it. What would I say? That I heard footsteps? That someone stood outside my tent but left no trace? Nobody would care. It wasn't illegal to walk through the woods. But I haven't camped alone since. Not because of what I saw, because I didn't see anything. But because of what I didn't see. Because of that silence. Because someone was out there, watching, waiting, and maybe they didn't do anything. But maybe next time they will. Camping was just part of life growing up. Every summer, my family packed up the old station wagon or minivan and took off to a beach or campground somewhere along the East Coast. My parents didn't believe in flying. They liked the road, liked the ritual of it. Coolers in the trunk, tent poles rattling under bags, folding chairs wedged between sleeping bags. It was always the same three places: Virginia Beach, Assateague Island, and this miserable, mosquito-ridden place called Westmoreland. I didn't mind camping as a kid. It was normal to me, Every summer had the same smell: ocean salt, charcoal smoke, sunscreen, wet towels drying on a line strung between trees. I'd fall asleep to cicadas or the low hum of distant cars on nearby roads. We weren't an adventurous family. We didn't hike or climb or do anything special. We just drove, set up, stayed a few nights, and moved on. But one trip, probably around 1997 or 98, has stayed with me in a way none of the others ever did. It was one of our trips to Assateague. If you've never been, Assateague Island is this long, thin barrier island that stretches along the coast of Maryland and Virginia. It's famous for wild horses. They call them ponies because they're smaller, but they're feral, completely untamed, and roam all over the place. The island has two sides, one run by Maryland and the other by Virginia. We camped on the Maryland side, near the beach where you could fall asleep listening to the surf. That year, we got lucky and found a decent campsite not far from the dunes. It was set back just enough from the beach to be quiet, but still close enough that we could carry chairs out every morning and sit with our feet in the surf before breakfast. There were 5 of us on that trip: my parents, my older brother, my little sister, and me. We had 2 tents. One big one where my parents and sister slept, and a smaller one for me and my brother. We set up camp the usual way. Dad fussed with the stakes and the rainfly. Mom laid out sleeping bags and inflated pads. We set up a little cooking area with the Coleman stove and the blue water jug on the folding table. The fire ring had the usual pile of leftover ashes, bits of burnt wood, half-melted beer cans from whoever was there last. Nothing new. The first couple of days went by like they always did. Lazy mornings, sunburns, soggy peanut butter sandwiches, bugs in the cooler, long afternoons under umbrellas. At night, we'd eat grilled hot dogs and stare at the stars while my dad poked at the fire like it had done something to offend him. I remember the second night especially well. It had been windy most of the day, and by sundown, the air had that weird stillness that comes after a lot of weather. The kind of quiet that feels too quiet, like even the bugs are waiting for something. The fire smoked more than it burned that night, and we all ended up turning in a little earlier than usual. My brother and I zipped up our tent and laid back on the crinkly pads, listening to the wind scrape sand against the sides. I must have fallen asleep sometime after midnight. What woke me up wasn't a sound, at least not one I remember clearly. It was more of a feeling, a kind of shift in the atmosphere. The way the air suddenly felt more alive, like something had stepped into it. When I opened my eyes, everything was dark, except for a dull gray light bleeding through the mesh at the top of the tent. Moonlight. I rolled over and sat up slightly, trying to figure out what time it was. That's when I heard the zipper on the big tent nearby. Not opening, but that faint metallic clink it makes when it's pulled taut and brushed by fabric. Then I heard movement, not footsteps, not talking. Just the sound of someone shifting in their sleeping bag. Then stillness. I waited, trying to tell if it was just my imagination or if someone was actually up. That's when I noticed the moonlight wasn't consistent. It flickered slightly, like something was moving in front of the tent. I didn't think much of it at first. Shadows, maybe a branch in the wind. But there weren't any trees close enough to cast shadows that strong. Then I heard a sudden, sharp breath. Not mine, not my brother's. Came from the other tent. That's when I unzipped our tent just slightly, pulling the flap back just enough to look toward the main one. In the moonlight, I saw something that made my stomach twist. There was someone or something standing just outside my parents' tent, directly in front of the zippered flap. The silhouette was clear, even in low light. It looked like an old woman, hunched slightly, with long, stringy hair falling down over her shoulders. Her arms hung stiff at her sides, and her head was tilted forward in this weird, unnatural way, like she was staring down into the tent, not through it, but right through the fabric, like she knew where the people were inside. She didn't move. She just stood there, unmoving in the sand. I froze. For a few long seconds, I just watched. My heart was beating hard in my chest, but I didn't make a sound. Something about the way she was standing, stiff, still, like she was part of the landscape, didn't feel right. It didn't feel human. Not exactly. I couldn't see her face, just the outline of her shoulders, the uneven strands of hair, the strange way her feet were planted. Then she twitched just slightly, like a flinch or a shake. I wanted to wake my brother, but I couldn't move. I kept staring, willing my eyes to adjust more, trying to make out features. Was it really a person? Someone from another campsite? A woman walking around in the dark? But it wasn't any of those things. Suddenly, the figure jerked. Not away, but down, like it was crouching or slipping forward. Then it bolted. Not walked, bolted. And when it did, that's when everything clicked into place. What I had thought was a woman wasn't a woman at all. It was a pony, one of the wild ponies that roam the island. In the dark, with the moon behind it, its tangled mane had looked like hair. Its narrow snout, from a distance, had seemed like a face. Its hunched, motionless posture had taken on something almost human in the dim light. But when it ran, hoofs pounding sand, body low and fast, there was no mistaking it. It was a horse, a wild one, thin, salt-crusted, with a coat matted from the sea air. It tore off into the night, heading straight toward the dunes, its legs cutting sharp through the underbrush. I sat there, breathing hard, hands still on the tent flap. A few seconds later, I heard the other tent zip open. My mom stepped out, confused, barefoot. She looked around and called softly for my dad. They talked for a few seconds, then my dad stood up and walked around the site, checking the coolers and table. I heard the quiet sounds of canvas flapping as they unzipped the main tent, looked around, then zipped it back up again. I finally laid back down. The rest of the night passed without anything strange. No more movement, no more shadows, just the long, slow return of quiet. In the morning, we found hoof prints near the tent. Clear trail. The sand around the front of the flap was churned up, and there were prints going back through the brush toward the beach. Later, a park ranger came by and told us it was pretty common. The ponies had established trails that ran right through parts of the campground, and people often pitched tents without realizing they were directly on one of them. The horses would just keep walking through like nothing was there. Sometimes they stopped. Sometimes they wandered close. But if they got spooked, they took off. We hadn't known. Our tent was right on the path. The rest of the trip went by quietly. We didn't have any more run-ins with the ponies. But I never really slept well after that. Not because I was scared of horses or animals in general, but because of how close it had all felt. How thin the line was between seeing something and misunderstanding it. Between shadow and truth. From just a few feet away, in the dark, with nothing but moonlight and silence to go on, I had thought I was staring at a person. An old woman, maybe even something worse. My imagination had filled in the blanks. It had made the mane into hair, the shape into something human. But it was just a horse. Just a lost, thin, feral pony making its way to the beach in the middle of the night. That was all. But still, I remember it every time I go camping. I remember how quickly the mind can jump to the worst idea, how quickly the dark can twist the truth. I remember how cold the air felt that night, and how long it took me to fall back asleep after that shape took off toward the surf. And I remember how close that animal had gotten, how it stood, just staring, for a long, still moment before vanishing into the dunes. Even now, I can still see it. That moment burned into my memory like a photo, not of a horse, but of something that almost wasn't. I used to think raccoons were kind of harmless. I'd seen them mess around in the yard a few times, pawing through the grass, climbing up fences, waddling off when they spotted me through the window. They always looked like little masked bandits, with those twitchy paws and dark ringed tails. They didn't really scare me. I just thought they were bold, maybe a bit too clever for their own good. But then one morning I came out to our driveway and found our trash bin tipped over and garbage scattered across the gravel. Old takeout containers, eggshells, ripped up coffee filters, some empty cans. Just a whole mess of filth spread like someone had thrown a party. I figured it was the wind at first. It had been breezy the night before. But when I picked the bin up, I noticed something weird. On one side, the ground was torn up. A small but noticeable hole, like something had dug underneath the base of the bin to lift it from one side. And the hole wasn't just some pawing at the dirt. It had shape to it, a method. It angled down like a little tunnel, exactly under the corner of the bin, like it was planned. That stuck with me. I didn't have much time to think about it that day, though. I had a trip coming up, a camping trip I'd been planning for weeks. I was heading out alone, something I did a couple of times a year just to get away. I'd picked a spot about 2 hours from home, in a state forest that didn't get much traffic. Not too remote, but far enough that I wouldn't be hearing car horns or sirens at night. I had everything packed: tent, sleeping bag, camp stove, food, water, small axe, flashlight, spare batteries, and a few layers of clothes for the changing fall weather. I wasn't thinking about the raccoon when I left. I should have been. The campsite was nice. It sat back in a low spot just off an old Forest Service road that had been closed to cars years ago. You had to hike in about a half-mile past a downed gate, then cut off the path a little to find it. It was tucked under tall trees, mostly pines, and backed up against a rocky slope with a small stream nearby. The leaves were just starting to fall. The place smelled like dry bark, pine sap, and wet dirt. I set up my tent near the tree line, built a small fire ring with rocks, and laid out my cooking gear a bit off to one side. It was late afternoon by the time everything was done. I made a quick meal, sat on a foam pad near the fire, and watched the sun drop behind the ridge. There was no one else around, just birds settling into the canopy, the stream trickling behind me, and that soft rustle of wind pushing through the trees. It was calm, almost too calm. Before bed, I hung my food bag from a low branch on a pine tree nearby. It wasn't a bear hang, I wasn't in bear country, but I didn't want anything rooting through my stuff either. I tied it off carefully, checked my guy lines on the tent, and crawled in with my headlamp still strapped on. I fell asleep quickly. I woke up once during the night. Something rustled near the cooking area. Just soft sounds, metal tapping on metal. I figured it was a squirrel or maybe a bird scratching at leftover smells. I stayed inside the tent and listened for a bit. The sounds stopped. I rolled over and went back to sleep. In the morning, I stepped outside and saw the pot I'd used was tipped over. My water bottle was lying a few feet from where I'd left it. I checked the tree where I'd hung the food bag, and it was gone. The cord was still there, tied around the branch, but the bag was gone. I looked around and spotted it maybe 15 feet away, down near the rocks. The cord had been chewed or cut. I couldn't tell which. The bag itself had been opened. Not torn, not clawed open, but unzipped. Inside, half the food was missing. One granola bar was still there, but the peanut butter pouch and the jerky were gone. So was the trail mix. A crushed protein bar wrapper lay on the ground beside it. I crouched and examined the cord. It didn't look frayed like it had just snapped under weight. It looked like it had been chewed through near the knot, but the knot itself was still in place. I didn't like that. Still, I told myself maybe I tied it too tight, maybe it stressed the cord and it snapped. Maybe a raccoon got up the tree, pawed it loose, and took the food. Smart animals, after all. I cleaned up the mess, ate what was left, and spent the afternoon hiking down along the stream, trying to shake off the feeling that I'd been outsmarted. That evening, I didn't bother with the hang. I packed what food I had left inside a zippered stuff sack and placed it under the vestibule of the tent, just outside the main body. I set my aluminum pot on top of it. I figured the sound would wake me if anything tried again. That night was cold and dark. The fire was out by 9, and the woods felt heavy. Still, I lay in the tent listening for a while, then drifted off. Something woke me up close to midnight. A scrape, then a dull thud. I froze. Then I heard it again, the pot sliding across the ground. I snapped on my headlamp, unzipped the tent, and leaned out. There were 2 raccoons. One had its paws on the food sack, nudging the pot off to the side. The other was sitting nearby, watching. Its eyes glowed in the headlamp light, unmoving. I stepped all the way out, waving my arms. They ran, but not fast, not panicked. I picked up the sack and checked it. Unzipped, half open. A corner of the peanut butter wrapper stuck out. It had teeth marks on it, but nothing was gone yet. I zipped it back up, brought it into the tent with me, and placed it under my legs inside the sleeping bag. I didn't sleep much after that. Next morning, I looked around the tent and saw the same pattern as the day before. Small prints, tracks in the dirt that looped around the cooking spot, the tent, the tree where I'd originally hung the bag. I could see claw marks in the soft bark on that trunk now. They'd climbed it, and then not just knocked the bag down, but somehow undone it. I found one of my socks near the rock slope. It had been inside the vestibule with my boots. Now it was 20 feet away, and there was a hole in the ground near the tent. Small, fresh, dug during the night. It was right under the vestibule. They tried to dig under the tent to get to the food bag from below. It was the same shape and angle as the hole I'd seen back home under the trash bin. Like a little tunnel cut into the dirt just wide enough for paws to reach in. I filled it back in, packed up my gear, and decided I'd spend the last night in a different spot. Maybe a mile farther up the ridge. Somewhere these raccoons hadn't already scoped out. The hike wasn't far, but the trail was rougher. More rocks, steeper grade. I found a small flat spot above the stream, tucked behind some boulders. Not a perfect site, ground was uneven, but I was tired of being messed with. I set the tent on a slab of mostly bare ground, tied off the food bag high up again, and set the stove in a crevice where it couldn't be knocked over. I didn't start a fire. I just ate cold food and climbed into the tent early. The wind picked up that night. Trees creaked. I lay in the dark listening to the gusts slide through the branches above. Then I heard it, the soft crunch of leaves. Not from one direction, but from multiple sides. I clicked on the headlamp. Outside, just at the edge of the light, I saw them. Not one, not two, for raccoons, spaced apart, watching the tent. One of them stood up briefly on its back legs before dropping back down and vanishing into the dark. I pulled the food bag close, laid still, and turned off the light. For the next hour, I heard them moving. Light steps, digging sounds. Once or twice, something bumped against the side of the tent. I stayed completely still. Eventually, the sounds faded. By morning, the edge of the tent fly was covered in small paw prints. The cord I tied to hang the food bag was loose, but the knot was still there. I checked the bag, it was still zipped, still full. But I could see where the bark had been stripped around the branch. Claw marks, deep ones. I packed fast. No breakfast. Just broke camp and hiked back out as the sun came up. At the car, I threw everything in the back and locked the doors. Drove home, still half watching the trees in the rearview mirror. Back at the house, I took the trash bin from the side of the driveway and dragged it to the shed. I didn't want it outside anymore. I couldn't stop thinking about that tunnel under the bin. The way the raccoon had worked it out. How it had studied the structure, planned a way to unbalance it, and made the whole thing fall over like a lever. These animals weren't just opportunists. They were planners, problem solvers, coordinators. I don't go camping solo in that forest anymore. And I don't trust cute faces with tiny paws. Not when I've seen what they're capable of. Because bins don't stop raccoons. Not even close. I've always enjoyed camping. Not the fancy kind with generators or heated tents or any of that RV bullshit, but the real kind. Sleeping on the ground, cooking over a fire, and getting far enough out that you can't hear cars or see anyone else's flashlight through the trees. It's peaceful. It slows everything down. Most of the time, anyway. One weekend in late September, I drove out to a state forest about 2 hours from where I lived. It wasn't a place with formal campsites. You just picked a logging road, parked at the side, hiked in for a bit, and made your spot. I'd been there twice before. I liked how quiet it was. No crowds, no posted trails, just old pine forest and thick brush that soaked up sound. I got in around 2 p.m., parked off a little gravel road barely wide enough for my car, and hiked in about 1.5 miles with my pack. I brought enough to last 2 nights, just the basics. Tent, sleeping bag, some canned food, small stove, water, and a small hatchet. The weather was cool, cloudy. I figured I'd get some firewood cut, make camp, and spend the next 2 days reading and walking around. Simple. I found a little clearing near a dry creek bed. There were no signs of recent use, no cigarette butts, no broken bottles, no boot prints. That's what I wanted. I took my time setting up the tent, clearing dead branches, digging a little trench in case it rained. I even strung some 550 cord between two trees so I could hang my food bag. Not because of bears, I wasn't that far north, but just to keep things from sniffing around. At least that's what I thought. By dusk, I had a fire going. Nothing big, just enough to cook and keep warm. I sat beside it, ate a can of beef stew, and drank hot instant coffee from a metal cup. The woods were quiet. I could hear the wind in the pines, the occasional crack of a branch somewhere off, and that soft static noise of leaves rustling against each other. The fire popped now and then. I had my headlamp on and kept scanning the woods out of habit. You never really stop that once you've done enough solo trips. I turned in early that night, around 9:30, crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and laid in the bag listening to the forest settle in for the night. I left a small solar lantern on low outside the tent just in case I needed to get up and piss. It barely lit anything, just a faint blue glow in the grass. I remember thinking how still it was. Then I heard it. Not loud, just a soft rustle near where I had the food bag hanging. I froze. My hand was on the zipper of my sleeping bag, but I didn't move. I just listened. Something was out there. Not heavy, not fast, just slow and steady shuffling, like something sniffing around. I figured it was a raccoon, maybe a possum, nothing that would come near me. I waited a bit, then heard the sound stop. I laid there a while longer, then fell asleep. Next morning, I got out to check. Sure enough, the food bag was gone. The cord was still tied between the trees, but the bag itself had been untied and dragged off. I found it about 20 feet away in the brush. Empty, completely emptied out. Cans opened and licked clean, even the sealed trail mix bags torn open. I mean, the damn thing had been unzipped. Not chewed, not torn, unzipped. I stood there for a second just staring at it. I even laughed a little. Goddamn trash pandas, I muttered. Raccoons. Resourceful little fuckers. I'd seen videos of them opening coolers, even twisting off lids, but unzipping a bag and pulling it off a rope? That was a first. Still, it was on me. I should have tied it up higher, maybe used a carabiner. I kicked myself a little, but it was just one night. I had a couple extra protein bars in my coat pocket, and I always carried an emergency MRE in the bottom of my pack. I wasn't gonna starve. The rest of that day was uneventful. I hiked a bit, found a ridge with a nice view of the forest stretching out all the way to the hills. I saw deer tracks, heard a hawk overhead, but otherwise it was calm. I came back, made a small fire again, and cooked the MRE for dinner. Not great, but it kept me full. I kept my gear inside the tent with me that night. I didn't want a repeat performance, but I still woke up just past midnight. This time it wasn't just one raccoon. I could hear them, scratching around, sniffing, shuffling through the grass. There had to be more than one. I laid still again, heart beating harder now. I hadn't heard them come up. Just suddenly, they were there, surrounding the tent. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just listened. The sound of claws on nylon. They were pawing at the corners of the tent. One tried tugging at the zipper. I kept still, breathing slow. It was eerie. I mean, I knew they weren't dangerous. Not like bears. But it's different when you're zipped up in thin fabric and can hear tiny claws pulling at it. Then silence again. After maybe 20 minutes of soft rustling, they were gone. I waited a while longer, then fell asleep. In the morning, I stepped out slowly, looking around. That's when I noticed something weird. There were rocks placed around the tent. I don't mean scattered. I mean placed. Small, smooth ones in a rough circle. It wasn't perfect, but they were definitely arranged. I stared at them for a while, trying to remember if I'd done that. But I hadn't. I was sure. I don't make rock circles. I don't even pick up rocks when I set up camp unless I need to move them from under the tent. That creeped me out. I walked the perimeter of the camp, found a few paw prints. Small ones. Raccoons, definitely. One was fresh, still sunk into damp earth near where I'd thrown the stew can the night before. That's when I noticed another thing. My hatchet was gone. It had been stuck in the side of a log right near the fire pit. I always leave it there when I'm not using it. Now it was gone. I checked the area, thinking maybe I knocked it over or moved it without realizing. Nothing. I walked in a wide circle, scanning the ground. I finally found it about 30 feet into the woods, half buried under leaves, like it had been dragged and dropped. The blade was clean, no signs of use. That's when it hit me. What the hell would a raccoon want with a hatchet? I packed up early that day. I wasn't planning to leave until the next morning, but something didn't feel right. The rocks, the missing tool, the way they came right up to the tent. I just didn't want to risk another night. But here's the thing. The car was still a mile and a half hike through woods. I had to cross the dry creek, follow my flagging tape trail, and climb a little hill before I could even see the road. I left around 10 a.m. with my pack light, since most of the food was gone, and started out. It was quiet again. Even the birds were few and far between. I passed the place where I found the hatchet and made a point to walk wide around it. Just felt better. About halfway to the road, I heard something behind me. At first, it was just a shuffle, a twig snap. I stopped, listened. Nothing, just wind. I started walking again. Another snap. I turned quick, saw a flash of movement, low to the ground, maybe 20 feet off the trail. I kept walking faster now. It followed. I couldn't see it, but I could hear it. Low footsteps. Then it stopped again. I pulled the hatchet from my side pocket. I didn't like carrying it in my hand, but now it felt right. I turned a corner, climbed the last ridge near the road, and glanced back one more time. That's when I saw it. 4 raccoons, just standing there, not eating, not running, just staring. One was bigger than the others. It sat back on its haunches like it was waiting. The others were still, watching. I didn't run. I just turned and walked the rest of the way to the car, not looking back again. I unlocked the door, threw the pack in, and drove off without taking off my boots. Back home, I told myself it was just raccoons, smart animals, opportunists. Maybe the rock circle was a coincidence. Maybe someone else had camped there months ago and left them. Maybe I knocked over the hatchet and didn't notice. But then, a week later, I went to unpack the tent. I shook it out in the backyard to clean off the dirt and leaves. As it unrolled, something small and round dropped out onto the grass. A smooth stone, just like the ones at the campsite. Same size, same color. Except this one had a little notch carved into the side. Not deep, just enough to notice. Not natural, not something from a raccoon. I don't go back to that part of the woods anymore. There's plenty of other forests, plenty of other campsites. And now, every time I pack, I count everything. I double-check zippers, double-check my tools, and I never leave my gear outside the tent. Because raccoons may be cute little bastards, but they're smart. Smarter than we think. Too smart. And if they're organizing, if they're figuring things out, we might not be at the top of the forest anymore. I camped alone a lot in my 20s. Sometimes I'd go with friends, but most of the time, I preferred to be by myself. Something about being away from everything. Phones, traffic, buildings, even voices just let me reset. It helped me clear my head and feel like I could breathe again. I wasn't running from anything dramatic. It was just peace I liked, quiet. So when I had a few days off in early May, I threw together my gear and drove out to a spot I'd camped at before. It was a few hours outside the city, past where most people stop. You have to drive down an old dirt road that gets pretty rough, and even then, you've got to hike in another mile or so to reach the spot. It's not marked on any official maps, but it's near a river bend and surrounded by thick pine woods, with only one narrow trail leading in and out. The first time I found it was by accident, and I'd gone back 3 times since. Every time, I was the only one out there. No people, no cars, nothing. I parked where the road ended and loaded up my backpack. The weather was decent, cool but not cold, with overcast skies and no wind. I made the hike in about an hour and found the clearing exactly as I left it last time. No signs of anyone having been there. No new trash, no footprints. Just soft dirt, pine needles, and the gentle rush of the river about 30 yards away. I set up camp. Just a simple tent, a tarp, my stove, and a folding chair. I gathered some deadfall and made a small fire ring like I'd done before. It wasn't anything huge, just enough to boil water and keep warm. That evening, I made instant noodles and sat by the fire, letting the orange light push back against the early dusk. It was peaceful, the way I like it, the kind of stillness you can't find anywhere else, the kind of quiet that makes your thoughts settle and stop racing. I sat there long after I'd eaten, just watching the flames dance, feeling the heat on my face while the cold air pressed against my back. The sun went down, and the shadows stretched out until they swallowed everything beyond the firelight. Sometime after dark, something felt off. I didn't hear anything unusual, didn't see anything either. It was just a shift, a tension in the air. You spend enough time in the woods, you start to notice when the background changes. It's like how you notice when a fridge stops humming in a quiet kitchen. It's the absence of noise that gets you. The crickets had gone quiet. The river was still, but I didn't hear the normal flutter of leaves or the snap of small twigs from animals moving around. It was just still. I figured maybe a larger animal had wandered nearby. That happens sometimes. Deer, even black bears if you're unlucky. I didn't panic. I just made sure my food was sealed and hung from a branch, then moved a little closer to the fire. I sat with my back to the largest tree nearby, just to have something solid behind me. But that fire didn't last long. I had stepped away for a few minutes to relieve myself, maybe 30 or 40 feet into the trees. When I came back, the fire was out. Not burned out, put out. There was a small pile of dirt kicked over the ring, like someone had taken their boot and shoved it in hard to smother the flames. The logs were still warm. I could smell the smoke curling up. I stood there for a few seconds, just trying to make sense of it. There hadn't been a gust of wind. There was no sign of rain. And the way the dirt had been scattered, it wasn't natural. Someone had stomped it out on purpose. I looked around. Nothing. Just trees and shadows. I didn't want to call it fear yet, but my stomach turned a little. I kept still, listening hard. Nothing but the sound of my own breathing. I thought maybe someone had come through, seen the fire, and put it out thinking I had left it unattended. That would make sense, right? Concerned hikers, forest rangers, someone who saw it from a distance. Maybe they just didn't want to stick around. They saw no one by the fire and decided to kill it. No harm done. But that idea started to crumble as the night went on. I stayed up later than I normally would have, just sitting in my chair with my headlamp turned on low, facing the woods. I didn't rebuild the fire. I didn't want to draw attention if someone really was out there. The quiet stuck around. That same heavy silence that made every leaf crackle sound sharp as glass. Then I heard it. A branch breaking. Close. Then nothing. I waited. Then another. Farther away but definite. Another footstep. Then silence again. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't trying to get my attention. They weren't yelling, weren't making themselves known. They were just moving. Slowly. Like they didn't want to be seen. And they were circling. I could tell by the direction of the sounds. I sat still for nearly 2 hours. Eventually, it stopped. Or maybe I just stopped noticing it. But the forest stayed quiet. At some point, I laid down in my tent, knife in my hand, eyes wide open. I didn't sleep, not even a little. The next morning, everything looked the same. My food was untouched. No boot prints I could see. No broken branches. Just an empty fire pit filled with dirt and a sick feeling in my chest. I packed up fast. Didn't make breakfast. Didn't sit to enjoy the morning. I loaded everything and hiked out. I kept my knife in my pocket the whole time. Back at the car, nothing was out of place. But I still felt like I was being watched as I loaded my gear and drove off. Later, when I told someone about it, they offered a simple explanation. They were probably just concerned about the fire going with no one watching it and kicked dirt on it until it went out. That was all they said. And maybe that's all it was. Maybe someone just passed through, made a call about what they saw, and moved on. But I've gone over every detail in my head, over and over. The footsteps, the circling, the total silence. The fact that they didn't call out, didn't say anything, didn't leave any trace except the dirt on the fire. Could have been nothing. Could have been someone doing the right thing. Or it could have been someone checking if I was there, watching, waiting to see if I'd come back. I'll never know, but I've never camped alone since.